Okay, so you've brought us some really fascinating stuff this time,
Yeah.
focusing on, the impact of things that happen during childhood, like trauma and stuff. And I think what's so interesting is how these early experiences, they can have such lasting effects on us as adults.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
I think what we want to try to do in this deep dive is to help you really get to the heart of how that actually happens.
Right.
Like, how do these early things that happen, how do they sort of play out in our adult lives? More importantly, what can we actually do about it? Like, what are the clear pathways to healing that you can start applying to your life right now?
Yeah, I love that.
And I think the good thing about this is that it's not just about like, rehashing all those old painful memories or anything like that. It's more about trying to extract those key understandings that can help you understand what you're experiencing today.
Exactly. And the resources you shared, they really do offer a very strong foundation, I think, for exploring how these events from our childhood can really continue to shape our lives.
Mm.
And often in ways that are so subtle, that we might not always connect them back to their origins.
Yeah, it's like you don't even realize it's happening.
Yeah.
So our goal here is to really kind of distill all that down for you.
Yeah.
Take all this research that you've given us
Mm.
and turn it into something practical and useful.
Exactly.
So basically, we're going to explore a few different areas.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to start by clearly defining what we mean by childhood trauma. Like, what are we actually talking about here?
Right.
And then we're going to dive into this whole idea of the inner child, which I think is super fascinating.
It is, yeah.
How these early experiences can actually become almost like a part of who we are now, like they live inside us.
They really do.
And then we're going to look at the different ways that past trauma can show up in your life as an adult.
Mm.
And not just emotionally, but also mentally and even physically, believe it or not.
It can, yeah.
It can have a huge impact on your physical health. And then finally, we're going to focus on some really practical, actionable steps that you can start taking right now to begin healing.
Yeah.
So our aim here is to give you those aha moments
Yeah.
where you suddenly understand something new about yourself.
Yeah.
And our goal is to leave you feeling empowered to move forward
Right.
rather than just like overwhelmed by all this information.
Exactly. And, as we go through all of this, I think it's so important to keep in mind that every single person's experience is completely unique.
Yeah.
What might feel, relatively small or insignificant to one person could have a profound and lasting impact on another,
Absolutely.
especially when we're talking about children who are still, developing their understanding of the world and their own ways of coping with difficult situations.
Yeah. So let's just dive right in, shall we? Can we
Okay.
talk about childhood trauma? What are we really focusing on here? Your sources define it as any event or experience during childhood that has a lasting negative emotional or psychological impact.
Right.
And that can include so many different things we're talking about, physical or emotional abuse, neglect, and neglect.
Mm-hmm.
It can be less visible sometimes, but it can be incredibly damaging. We're
Absolutely.
talking about the loss of a parent or a primary caregiver, witnessing violence, maybe within the home, within the community, or even just growing up in an environment that's constantly stressful and unstable.
Right. And it's so important what you just said about, sometimes we think of trauma, our minds go to these like big events, these huge things.
Yeah.
But what your source material is pointing out is that it can be these more subtle, ongoing conditions as well
Yeah.
that create a persistent sense of fear and insecurity in a child.
Yeah. It's that constant underlying tension
Exactly.
where you never really feel safe.
Right.
And I think what's really insightful here is that it's not just the event itself, it's how the child actually processes that event.
Absolutely.
That's what defines trauma.
It's about how that child's developing brain and emotional system interpret and copes with what's happening around them.
And your source talks about this. It says that some children will compartmentalize things.
Mm-hmm.
Like they'll almost tuck these experiences away
Exactly, to kind of manage it.
as a way to manage. Yeah.
Yeah.
While other children might completely internalize those experiences
Right.
and carry the weight of them inside.
Exactly.
And that can really affect
Yeah.
how they see themselves and how they see the world.
100%.
So what's really important for you to consider is that even seemingly small events or ongoing stressors during your childhood, they could have had a huge impact on you,
Yeah,
an impact that you might be only beginning to recognize now.
absolutely. And I think this whole process of internalizing
Yeah.
is really where this idea of emotional wounds comes in.
Okay, yeah.
Think of these emotional wounds as almost like scars, on your emotional landscape.
Okay.
And these scars influence how you react to new situations and new experiences. And these imprints are left by these unprocessed experiences. And they can continue to affect us long into adulthood, often beneath the surface of our conscious awareness.
You don't even realize it's happening.
Exactly.
And I think your sources make a really good point here. They connect this to the inner child,
Right.
this part of us that holds on to those early emotional imprints and beliefs.
Yeah. So maybe we should explore that a little bit more.
Yeah,
What
absolutely.
do we actually mean when we talk about the inner child?
So, when we talk about your inner child, we're talking about the part of you that still holds on to all those emotions, memories, and experiences from your childhood, both the positive and the negative ones.
Hmm.
And when there has been trauma, this inner child can really carry the weight of those times. That feeling of vulnerability, of fear, of being misunderstood or feeling unsafe.
Right.
The important thing to remember is that those emotions and beliefs of your younger self, they're still active within you.
Wow.
And they can influence your reactions in ways that you might not always understand. So it's almost like having this younger version of ourselves still living inside us.
In a way,
It's not like a literal little person, right?
right, not a separate person, but more like this collection of all those early feelings,
Yeah.
needs, and beliefs that still influence us today.
Okay, I see. And when past trauma hasn't been fully processed or dealt with,
Yeah.
this inner child can carry a lot of emotional pain.
Absolutely. And what's so fascinating is how that can show up in our adult lives
Yeah.
in ways that don't always seem connected to those early experiences.
Right. You might not even realize that's what's happening.
Right.
Your sources actually give some really good examples of this in action,
Oh, yeah.
like experiencing emotional reactions that just seem way out of proportion to what's actually happening.
Right.
Overreacting to criticism, feeling really rejected even in small disagreements,
Yeah.
or just having a really hard time trusting people in general.
Absolutely.
And these can all be signs that the inner child's past experiences of being hurt or let down are influencing how you're responding now.
Right, because if you think about it, if that inner child learned that criticism equals danger or that rejection equals abandonment,
Yeah.
those emotional responses, they can be triggered even in situations that are rationally not threatening.
Right, because in your mind, it's like that same situation is happening again.
Exactly.
And if we look at this, in the context of your relationships in general,
Yeah.
your sources talk about something called attachment issues.
Right.
And it makes total sense.
Yeah.
If your early relationships with people who cared for you were inconsistent, unreliable, or emotionally unsafe,
Yeah.
it's totally understandable that you might have a hard time with intimacy
Right.
or forming those secure and trusting bonds as an adult.
Absolutely.
And there's this idea of people-pleasing behaviors as a coping mechanism
Yes.
that really stuck with me.
Yeah.
Because it's like, if your sense of safety as a child depended on constantly pleasing everyone around you, that can become so ingrained in who you are,
Right. It becomes a habit.
even when you're no longer in that situation.
Exactly. And it becomes a survival strategy.
Right.
It's how the inner child learns to make sure its needs are met.
Yeah.
Or to avoid any potential conflict or harm.
Right.
And the problem is, it can come at the cost of your own well-being and being able to express yourself authentically.
Yeah. You're not really being true to yourself.
Exactly.
So we're really starting to see how these past experiences can shape our lives today, right?
We are, yeah.
But the impact of all this, it goes way beyond just our emotional responses, right?
It does, yeah.
Your sources talk about how this can affect our mental and physical health, too.
Right, right.
So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So your source material points out that there's a really strong link between unresolved childhood trauma and mental health challenges. Things like anxiety, depression, PTSD, and even things like substance abuse.
Right.
And what's so important to understand here is that trauma can actually change how our brains process emotions and stress. So it can sometimes lead to what we call a hypervigilant nervous system,
Okay.
which means your body and mind are constantly on high alert.
Like you're always expecting something bad to happen.
Exactly.
Okay.
So you become much more reactive to anything that you perceive as a threat.
Right.
And it becomes much harder to regulate your emotions.
Right. Right. And it's not just our minds, is it?
No, it's not.
Your sources also make this really important connection between childhood trauma and our physical well-being.
Right.
They say there's a potential link to a higher risk of chronic illnesses, just increased stress levels in general.
Right.
And they even give some really specific examples like frequent headaches, digestive problems,
Yeah.
trouble sleeping, things like that.
Yeah.
It's almost like our bodies are holding onto the stress of those early experiences.
Yeah, the mind-body connection is so powerful.
Yeah.
Prolonged stress, especially when it stems from early adversity,
Yeah.
it can have very real physical consequences over time.
It's like our bodies remember even when our minds try to forget.
Yeah.
So all of this is so important for understanding what might be going on in your life right now.
Yeah.
It helps you realize that these difficulties you're facing, they're not just random or some kind of personal failing.
Mm-hmm.
They could be a direct result of what happened earlier in your life.
Right.
And your sources make this really important point
Yeah.
that simply understanding this connection is often the first step toward making positive changes
Absolutely.
and starting to heal.
It's about recognizing those patterns
Yeah.
and starting to address the root causes of the challenging.
Rather than just dealing with the symptoms on the surface.
Exactly.
So we've talked about what childhood trauma is, how it affects that inner child part of ourselves,
Right.
and the impact it can have on us as adults.
Yeah.
So now let's get to the good stuff, right?
Let's do it.
The part about healing.
Yes.
Your sources emphasize that this isn't about erasing the past or pretending it didn't happen.
Right.
It's about acknowledging the pain that you experienced
Mm-hmm.
and learning to process it in a healthy way
Exactly.
so that you can move forward in your life.
And it's such an important distinction
Yeah.
because healing from trauma, it's not about forgetting.
Right.
It's about integrating those experiences into your story in a way that they no longer control your feelings, your thoughts, and your behaviors.
Right.
So the first step is acknowledging the wounds. This
Okay.
means consciously recognizing that past trauma has impacted you,
Yeah.
your emotions, your patterns.
And taking ownership of that.
Yeah, taking ownership. And I think it's really helpful to just take some time to reflect,
Yeah.
on those childhood experiences
Mhm.
and start to see the connections
Right.
between those experiences and what's going on in your life today.
Yeah. And your sources say that therapy can be really helpful during this process
Absolutely.
because sometimes it can get pretty complicated and it's sensitive stuff, right,
It is, yeah.
to unpack.
Yeah, and just having that safe space to talk about it,
Yeah.
a confidential, supportive environment,
Mm.
it can make such a difference.
Yeah. It's so important to have that.
It is.
And from there, your source material talks about the importance of self-compassion,
Yes,
which I think is so crucial,
I agree.
especially when you think about how that inner child can often carry so much shame and guilt.
Right, for things that were never their fault.
Exactly.
So learning to treat yourself with the same kindness and understanding that you would offer to a child who is hurting is so essential.
Yeah.
Your sources even suggest speaking to yourself.
Like you were talking to a child.
Exactly. It's about replacing those critical inner voices
Right.
with that gentle, supportive voice.
Yeah, it's like you're reparenting yourself almost.
It is. It is. And remember, healing isn't linear.
Mhm.
It takes time, and it's not always straightforward.
Right.
So patience and gentleness towards yourself,
Yeah.
they're so important throughout this journey.
That leads us to this concept of reparenting, which I think is really interesting.
Yeah.
What does that actually look like in our everyday lives?
So reparenting is essentially about consciously giving yourself
Yeah.
the care, validation, and love that you may have missed out on
Right.
during childhood.
Okay.
Your sources give some really great examples. Setting healthy boundaries in relationships,
Mm-hmm.
something that may have been absent
Right.
in maybe a chaotic or a neglectful environment growing up.
Right.
It involves making sure you're taking care of yourself,
Yeah.
both physically and emotionally,
Right.
and offering yourself that emotional support,
Mm-hmm.
that reassurance that maybe wasn't there for you consistently in the past.
Like you're filling in the gaps in
Amen.
that childhood.
It's about becoming that loving and supportive figure
Wow.
that your inner child needed.
That's a really powerful way to think about it.
It is, yeah.
Your sources also talk about healing through creative expression,
Oh, yeah.
which makes sense. It's like giving that inner child a voice
Absolutely.
that might have been silenced in the past.
And, a lot of times, childhood trauma involves having your feelings dismissed,
Right.
not validated.
Yeah.
Or maybe you didn't have that safe space to express them.
Right.
So finding those creative outlets like
Yeah.
drawing, painting, writing,
Mm.
even just talking about your experiences,
Yeah.
they can be incredibly therapeutic.
And your sources specifically mention journaling
Yes.
as a really powerful way to process those buried feelings.
Right, it gives you that outlet
Yeah.
that maybe wasn't available at the time.
Right.
A healthy and private way to express those emotions.
Yeah. And finally, your sources recommend seeking professional help
Yes, it's so
when
important.
you're dealing with the effects of trauma.
Absolutely.
And they emphasize that this kind of healing,
Yeah,
it can be really complex.
it can be.
It can be challenging.
Yeah.
So having the support of a trained therapist can be so valuable.
100%. And therapists who specialize in trauma,
Yeah.
they have that specific expertise, They've got the training, the tools
Yeah.
to really guide you through this
Yeah.
in a safe and effective way.
And your sources mention EMDR and CBT as examples of therapeutic approaches that have been shown to help with trauma.
Absolutely.
Can you tell us a little bit about those?
Yeah, so EMDR uses eye movements and other bilateral stimulation
Okay.
to process traumatic memories.
Oh, wow.
And then CBT focuses on identifying and changing those negative thought patterns.
Right.
And what's so great about therapy is it's a confidential and supportive space
Yeah.
where you can safely explore those difficult feelings,
Yeah.
get your experiences validated,
Yeah.
and learn healthier coping skills.
Yeah, so it's like having a guide
Yes.
to help you navigate all the complex emotions and memories that come with trauma
Sorry.
and help you process those difficult experiences in a way that leads to healing.
Okay, so as we start to do this work, this healing work,
Yeah.
what kind of positive changes can we expect to see? Well, your sources talk about this amazing transformative potential of healing that inner child part of ourselves, and they describe how it can lead to so many positive changes in your life.
Like what kind of changes?
Well, you might see improvements in your self-esteem
Okay.
as you learn to be more compassionate towards yourself
Right.
and consistently practice that reparenting,
Yeah.
your relationships with others.
Mm,
They can become more fulfilling and more authentic
right.
as you let go of those old patterns.
Yeah, like the distrust.
Yeah, the distrust, the avoidance, the people-pleasing.
Yeah, those coping mechanisms.
Exactly, those things that might have helped you survive back then,
Right.
but they're not serving you anymore.
Yeah. And overall, you could just experience more life satisfaction.
More inner peace.
Yeah.
Stronger connection to who you really are.
So it's not just about fixing the past.
Right.
It's about breaking free from those old patterns
Exactly.
that no longer serve you.
Yeah, it's about empowering yourself to choose healthier and more fulfilling ways
Right.
of thinking, feeling, and behaving.
I love that. And your sources give some really encouraging examples.
They do,
Of
yeah.
being able to trust more in your relationships, not reacting so intensely to things that might have triggered you in the past,
Right.
feeling more secure in who you are,
Yes,
having a stronger sense of your own worth.
absolutely.
So it sounds like it's not just about healing the past, it's about creating a more fulfilling and peaceful future.
Exactly.
Like you said, it's about thriving, not just surviving.
100%.
So to wrap it all up,
Yeah.
what we've learned from your sources
Yeah,
is that healing from childhood trauma, it's definitely possible.
it is.
It's a journey, it's personal,
Yeah.
and it really comes down to understanding and nurturing that inner child within us.
Absolutely. That part of us that still holds on to those early experiences.
And as you continue on this journey, I want you to consider this.
Okay.
How might understanding your inner child not only change how you react to the world around you,
Yeah.
but also how it can change your deepest desires and aspirations for the future?
I love that.
It's like moving beyond just getting by to really living your best life.
Yeah, exactly.
That's a really beautiful thought to leave us with. Thank you so much for sharing all these amazing resources with us
You're welcome.
and taking this deep dive with us. I hope you found it
Me
insightful
too.
and that it's given you some clarity
Yeah,
and direction on your own journey of healing and
absolutely.
self-discovery.
It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.